On a night in the year 1974, an 18-year-old girl was leaving her university when she suddenly saw a man limping down the street, walking with a crutch. The man fell, and she stopped to check on him. She asked, "Are you okay? Is everything fine?" and picked up his bag from the ground to help him. He told her that his car was nearby and politely asked if she could help carry his bag to the car. But as she was placing the bag inside, he suddenly struck her from behind, knocking her unconscious. He then put her into his car, got in, and drove off to a distant location. This girl was one of the earliest victims of Ted Bundy, the most infamous serial killer in the United States and the world. He wasn't the most violent serial killer or the one with the highest number of victims, but he was undoubtedly the most famous. His trial was the first to be broadcast on television in America because people were highly interested in the case and followed it closely. Ted Bundy was a murderer who specifically targeted women, especially young university students. He confessed to killing 30 victims, but estimates suggest that he likely murdered over 100. Many people describe Ted Bundy as handsome, and it's undeniable that he was a well-groomed man, highly conscious of his appearance. He spoke in a very eloquent and charming manner. When you talked to him, you would feel like you were conversing with an intelligent, polite, and even kind person. This was one of the main reasons why many of his victims, most of them young women, fell for his charisma. Ted Bundy is considered the father of serial killers, inspiring most of the serial killers that emerged in America during the 1970s and 1980s. His story is one of the most mind-bending, and as you progress through it, you will find that the events become increasingly insane. This is one of the most significant and intense stories I will cover on my channel, so don't miss it. Stay tuned until the end. Before diving into today's story, I must mention that this topic may not be suitable for family gatherings. As always, I will try my best to keep the content clean. However, to fully convey the story, I cannot erase these events entirely, but I will soften and obscure them as much as possible. From the moment he was born, Ted Bundy's life was anything but normal. His mother, Alina, became pregnant with him at a relatively young age, 22 years old. Worse still, she was unmarried, meaning the pregnancy resulted from an illegitimate relationship. This happened in 1966, and even in the relatively liberal American society, an unmarried woman getting pregnant was heavily frowned upon. Alina's parents, Ted Bundy's grandparents, tried to hide the pregnancy from their neighbors, relatives, and social circle. They sent their daughter to give birth at a distant hospital in another city. Alina considered leaving her newborn for adoption after giving birth. However, her father, Ted's grandfather, insisted that she bring the child home, promising that they would raise him themselves. The baby was named Ted and grew up believing that his grandparents were his real parents. His actual mother, Alina, was introduced to him as his older sister. Even as a child, his life was strange. To make things worse, his grandfather was an extremely harsh and abusive man. He frequently beat, mistreated, and even insulted Ted. The boy grew up in an environment worse than terrible. At a young age, he began displaying behaviors commonly seen in future criminals. He started torturing animals, setting stray cats on fire, and attacking neighborhood children. He even set up traps between trees and in places where kids played. One of the neighborhood girls suffered a severe leg injury after falling into a pit he had dug and filled with spikes and harmful objects. On several occasions, he even attempted to drown children in the local swimming pool. The most disturbing part was that he never showed any signs of remorse or regret. On the contrary, he took pride in these actions. One of the most infamous incidents from his childhood occurred when he was 6 years old. His aunt, who was his babysitter at the time, was feeling unwell and decided to take a nap on the bed. She slept for about an hour, and when she woke up, she was shocked to find knives surrounding her body, placed in a circular pattern. Looking at the knives, she recognized them as the ones from the kitchen. When she asked 6-year-old Ted about it, he admitted that he had placed them there. When she asked him why, he simply said he was playing. From childhood, it was clear that this boy had a serious psychological issue. Yet he grew up to become a handsome, well-dressed, and articulate young man, at least on the surface. At the age of 15, Ted Bundy discovered by chance that Alina, whom he had believed was his older sister, was actually his mother. He found his birth certificate, which listed Alina as his mother and his father as unknown. It also stated that he was an illegitimate child. This revelation likely triggered deep psychological issues regarding women. If his own mother had deceived him about her identity his entire life, he might have thought that other women were even worse and unworthy of trust. This could be considered his first psychological wound. Years passed, and by 1966, Ted was 20 years old. Despite his troubled childhood, he was intelligent and graduated high school with high grades. He enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle, the city where he lived. During his studies, he met a girl named Diane Edwards. Initially, their relationship was just friendship, but it quickly evolved into love. Diane and Ted came from different social classes. His family was considered poor, whereas Diane's was wealthy. Despite this, she was drawn to him. Ted was handsome, well-groomed, and above all, intelligent, with a refined and charming way of speaking. He was equally attracted to her, but their class differences made Ted feel he had to work extra hard to keep her. He focused all his energy and attention on the relationship, making her the center of his life. As a result, he lost focus on his studies and began failing some courses. He spent an entire year struggling, unable to pull himself out of the downward spiral he had fallen into. At that point, Diane started losing interest in him. Eventually, she decided to leave him and break up. This devastated him. He tried everything to convince her to change her mind, but she was firm in her decision. This could be considered his second psychological wound, the beginning of his deep resentment toward women. That period was one of the worst in his life. He fell into severe depression and never returned to his studies. By 1968, at 22 years old, he dropped out of university and spent a long time in a state of aimlessness. During this period, his mind began wandering into dark fantasies. For example, he would see a girl walking down the street and imagine doing unspeakable things to her. He later admitted that he used alcohol and marijuana to suppress these thoughts. One of his disturbing habits was peeping into homes, standing near windows, and spying on the people inside. He primarily targeted the residences and dormitories of young women, especially university students. Sometimes, he would see a girl walking down the street and follow her to her home. One night, he was walking while intoxicated or high when he saw a girl approaching from the opposite direction on the same sidewalk. She entered her home and turned her back to him. At that moment, he felt an overwhelming urge to harm her. He noticed a branch or piece of wood on the ground, picked it up and followed her. Then, he struck her on the head, knocking her to the ground, and immediately fled. The next morning, Ted feared that the police might suddenly knock on his door and arrest him. However, he assumed the girl had survived since there was no news of a murder in the newspapers. The police, having no clues or evidence, did not investigate the incident. This was the first act of violence he committed, and although it wasn't a murder, it was the spark that ignited everything. It was the door through which he would enter a dark world. However, his killing spree wouldn't start immediately. It would take time. Ted's life was about to take a positive turn in 1969. A year after dropping out of university and falling into depression over his ex-girlfriend, Diane, something significant happened in Ted Bundy's life. He met a new woman named Elizabeth Kendall. Elizabeth was a single mother raising a young daughter on her own. Ted approached her, and they got to know each other at a social event. Soon after, they entered into a romantic relationship. For Elizabeth, Ted was the perfect man who had come into her life at just the right time. He was kind and caring, and even became a father figure to her little daughter. He played with her, taught her how to ride a bicycle, took her out for walks, and even organized birthday parties for her. They became like a real family. This new relationship helped Ted regain his self-confidence. However, the darkness inside him never disappeared. He later decided to continue his studies and returned to the University of Washington in 1970 at the age of 24. He pursued a degree in psychology. Imagine someone like him studying psychology, a man who himself needed a psychologist. Despite everything, he managed to graduate in 1971, and his relationship with Elizabeth remained strong. After graduating, he secured a job at a suicide prevention hotline center. This was a place where people experiencing suicidal thoughts would call for help. Ted, with his psychology degree, worked as a phone operator, answering calls from people struggling with dark thoughts and trying to talk them out of suicide. Imagine a man like this, whose job was to prevent suicides, It was bizarre. He used this job to develop his skills in dealing with people and understanding their psychology, particularly young women who would call in distress. When a young woman called, he deliberately prolonged the conversation to analyze her mindset and emotions. This ability would later help him lure and manipulate his victims. Through his work, he also became involved in a committee of psychological experts who assisted the police in solving crimes and analyzing cases. This experience gave him a deep understanding of how law enforcement worked, how detectives investigated crimes, where their weaknesses lay, and what evidence they looked for at crime scenes. For someone planning to become a criminal, this knowledge was extremely valuable. During this time, Ted also worked at the office of the governor of Washington state and played a role in the success of the governor's re-election campaign. At this point, Ted Bundy's life had turned around 180 degrees. He had become a successful man, holding important positions and playing an active role in society, completely opposite to the failure he had been when Diane left him. Then, he did something strange. He traveled to California. Why? Because California was where his ex-girlfriend Diane lived. There he met with her, and they sat together talking. He told her about all the things he had accomplished, how he had completed his education, found a job, become successful, and even worked at the governor's office. Suddenly, Diane's perception of him changed. She had left him when he was a failure, lost and unfocused. But now, she saw in front of her the same charming, intelligent, and successful young man she had fallen for in the beginning. Almost immediately, she felt attracted to him again. Keep in mind, Ted didn't tell Diane that he was already in a relationship with Elizabeth. She had no idea that another woman existed in his life. With sweet words and manipulation, Ted won her back. He told her that he had done all this, changed his life, just so she would accept him again. Hearing this, she fell for him once more. In fact, things escalated to the point where he proposed marriage, and she accepted. For weeks, they remained engaged, and Diane believed they were moving toward a future together. Then, out of nowhere, Ted told her goodbye. Shocked, she asked him what was wrong, why he was doing this. He simply said, "The time when someone like you could play with me is over." Then he laughed in her face and left, just like she had once left him. All of this was just revenge. After this moment, Ted felt an intense rush of pleasure and satisfaction, unlike anything he had ever felt before. From that moment, he realized that breaking women emotionally would be his ultimate goal in life. He would enjoy every moment of it with every victim. Ted returned to Seattle, Washington, and went back to Elizabeth. At this point, he also decided to return to university for another degree, this time in law. It's unclear why he chose law specifically, but he managed to get accepted into law school with a recommendation letter from the governor's office, where he had worked. While studying law, he also began searching for his first victims. As I mentioned before, Ted had a habit of following and spying on women. On the night of January 4, 1974, he chose his first victim, an 18-year-old girl named Karen Sparks. He saw her walking on the street, followed her, and identified her residence. Late at night, when the lights went out and everyone was asleep, he broke into her home and entered her room while she was sleeping, completely unaware. Holding a metal rod, he suddenly attacked her, striking her on the head multiple times. She didn't even have time to wake up or understand what was happening before she lost consciousness. In this state, Ted assaulted her. When he was done, he fled the scene. Despite the severe blows to her head, by some miracle, she survived. She remained in a coma in the hospital for several days. Although she lived, the damage caused by Ted Bundy would stay with her for the rest of her life. At the time, DNA testing did not exist, so the police had no way of tracking down the criminal. After this attack, Ted went back to his normal life as if nothing had happened. At this time, he was 28 years old. Days passed, and within a month, he felt the urge to unleash his cruelty on another victim. This time, he wanted to enjoy torturing his victim even more. On February 1, 1974, he set his sights on a new target. The victim was a young woman studying at a local college. That night, she had gone out to drink with her friends at a bar. Ted saw her and was immediately attracted. He had a specific type, women who parted their hair in the middle. When he saw this girl, whose name was Linda Ann Healy, 21 years old, he instantly knew she would be his next victim. As she left the bar, he followed her through the streets until she reached her home. This house was a student residence shared by 5 girls, so Linda wasn't alone. Her housemates were sleeping in the rooms next to hers. Feeling safe, she went to bed. After all, when you live with others, you don't typically worry about safety. But Ted managed to break into the house without making a sound. He quietly crept inside until he reached Linda's room. This time, he strangled her with his hands, pressing tightly on her neck and stifling her screams until she lost consciousness. Afterward, he changed her clothes. No one knows why he dressed her in outdoor clothing. Then, he wrapped her in a blanket, covered her completely, and carried her out to his car. His car, by the way, was a Volkswagen Beetle, the small, rounded car often called the Bug. Ted drove her to a remote, forested area in the mountains. There, he took his time assaulting her before finally killing her. Linda Ann Healy became Ted Bundy's first confirmed murder victim. Her housemates noticed her absence the next morning and immediately reported it to the police. Linda's body wouldn't be found for months. Only her jawbone would be discovered later, much later. God knows what this monster did to the rest of her body. At first, the police didn't connect this crime to the previous attack on Karen Sparks a month earlier. There was no clear link between them. Meanwhile, Ted continued his crimes. He began refining his methods, inventing new ways to lure victims. Instead of breaking into their homes, he started going to them directly. Since he had studied psychology, he understood human nature and behavior very well. He decided to exploit people's compassion, especially that of women, to his advantage. He would sometimes pretend to be injured, wearing a cast on his arm to make it look broken or walking with crutches to appear weak. One of the first victims he used this trick on was a 19-year-old college student named Jorgen Hawkins. One evening, after leaving campus, she was walking down the street when she saw Ted struggling to carry his bag while limping with crutches. Suddenly, he collapsed on the ground in front of her, right after passing by her. Naturally, the girl stopped to help him. She picked up his bag from the ground to hand it to him, but he said, "My car is nearby. If you don't mind, could you help me carry my bag to the car?" She agreed, and when they reached the car, she asked him where he wanted her to place it. He told her, "On the passenger seat." She opened the car door but found that the passenger seat was missing. The seat had been removed entirely. Ted had emptied his car to make space for his victims' bodies. As she was looking inside the car, Ted grabbed a metal rod and struck her on the head from behind. She immediately lost consciousness. He then handcuffed her hands, threw her into the car, got in, and drove away. His initial plan was to take her to a secluded place, just as he had done with his first victim, a mountain or a forest, where he could assault her and do whatever he wanted. However, the plan changed quickly because, on the way, Jorgen began to regain consciousness. She was still dizzy and not fully aware, but she had woken up from unconsciousness. At that point, Ted was forced to stop the car, pull her out, and continue hitting her on the head until he was sure she was dead, right there in the middle of the street. Afterward, he put her body back into the car and took it to a remote area in the forest or mountains. Her body was never found, not even a trace of it. Ted continued committing crimes using the same method. Sometimes, instead of crutches, he used a cast on his arm, pretending it was broken to gain the sympathy of his victims and lure them to his car, just as he had done with Jorgen. The number of missing girls in the area, especially university and college students, began to increase over the following months. In those few months, Ted had kidnapped and murdered 7 women. People and the police started noticing the pattern and began linking the crimes together. They started considering the possibility that a single person, a serial killer, was responsible. This caused widespread fear in Seattle and throughout Washington state. During all this time, while Ted was committing one crime after another, he lived a double life. On one side, he was the monstrous killer we now know. On the other, he was a successful, kind, and loving man, living a normal and happy life with his girlfriend Elizabeth and her daughter. He had friends, a social circle, and would go out and spend time with them. They invited him to their homes, and he invited them to his. They would talk and laugh together. None of them had any idea about his other side. However, around this time, tensions between him and Elizabeth began to arise. Sometimes, he would ask her to do strange and disgusting things I can't even mention here. She started feeling that something was off about him. One day, they went on a trip together to a river and rode a kayak. Suddenly, Ted grabbed her and pushed her head underwater. She struggled, trying with all her strength to lift her head above the water, but he kept pressing down on her. She felt her breath running out. Finally, Ted let go, allowing her to surface. At that moment, Elizabeth saw a look on his face that she had never seen before, one of a terrifying monster. He was enjoying what he was doing. But that look only lasted a moment before he suddenly started laughing and told her he was just playing with her. She was so frightened that she didn't even dare to argue with him or ask if he had really tried to kill her. She later said that in that moment, she was truly terrified of him. She tried to brush it off as a joke, but deep down, she knew something was seriously wrong. If you ask for my theory, I think that when he pushed her underwater, he actually intended to kill her. But he likely changed his mind, realizing that her disappearance would draw unwanted attention, especially since they were alone together. If he returned without her, it would cause a major problem. It was clear that Ted was evolving. His boldness was increasing. Imagine, he transitioned from kidnapping women at night to abducting them in broad daylight, in public. Two of Ted's most infamous victims were Janice Ott and Denise Naslund. Ted kidnapped these two women on the same day, in broad daylight in a crowded public place. It was July 1974, summer in Washington near Seattle. There was a large lake called Lake Sammamish, surrounded by a big natural park. In the summer, people gathered there in large numbers. Entire families would spend time at this lake. Ted went there looking for new victims. He spotted a woman lying on the ground sunbathing. Her name was Janice Ott, his first victim that day. He approached her and, as usual, used his charm and manipulative tactics to flirt and get close to her. At the same time, he had a cast on his arm, pretending it was broken. After flirting with her and feeling confident that he had her under his control, he told her, "I have a boat, but I'm struggling to move it because my arm is broken. I'd be happy if you could help me. We can spend some time together." She was convinced and got up to go with him. Ted told her, "Let's go to my car first to grab some things." But of course, when they reached the car, he suddenly attacked her, knocking her unconscious and drove her away to a remote location. Normally, Ted would have stopped there. After committing a crime, he would usually wait some time before striking again. But that day, the darkness inside him was overwhelming. A few hours later, he returned to the same lake. There, he targeted another young woman named Denise Naslund. Using the same deceptive charm, he convinced her to go with him and kidnapped her. Both women suffered the same fate as the victims before them. But this time, something important changed in the case. There were many witnesses. After the two women disappeared, the police asked everyone who had been at the lake that day for any useful information. Several people had seen Ted approaching the two women. Some had even overheard the conversations between them. When introducing himself to the women, Ted had used his real name. He had told them, "My name is Ted." People who had heard this reported it to the police. Witnesses also provided a description of his appearance. They mentioned that he had been wearing a cast on his arm. Some had even seen his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. They described its color, beige or cream. The police created a sketch of the suspected killer and published it. They also announced that his name was Ted and shared the description of his Volkswagen Beetle. They urged the public to report any information about a man matching this description. From this moment, Ted Bundy's name and case began gaining widespread attention. Newspapers started writing about him. His face appeared on the front pages. However, Ted's face was very common. Nothing about his features stood out enough for people to recognize him instantly. Even the sketch didn't resemble him that much. Moreover, Volkswagen Beetles were extremely popular at the time. Tens of thousands of them were on the roads, especially in beige. Ted, of course, was following the news. He saw how his case was spreading, but he wasn't too worried. He knew it would be difficult for the police to track him down, even with all the information they had. What he didn't know, however, was that the person closest to him was already suspicious. His girlfriend, Elizabeth, had already sensed something was wrong. When she saw the news, the sketch, and the description of the beige beetle, she immediately suspected Ted. Although she still had some doubts, deep down she was sure. So Elizabeth called the police and reported him. She told them she suspected her boyfriend, Ted, was the serial killer they were looking for. She explained that he matched every detail of the description. At this point, you might think the police rushed to arrest Ted immediately, but the opposite happened. After investigating his background, the police ruled him out as a suspect. Instead, they tried to convince Elizabeth that she was overthinking things. They told her, "This is a successful man, a law student, someone who worked in the governor's office and even helped the police solve cases before." Instead of her convincing them that Ted was the killer, they convinced her that she was imagining things. The police had a list of over 100 men named Ted reported by the public. So, in a way, you can't completely blame them for initially overlooking Ted Bundy. On the surface, he seemed like a respectable, well-integrated member of society. They expected that the Ted they were looking for would be a monster both inside and out, most likely someone with a criminal record, a drug addict, or a person with a bad reputation. That was the kind of Ted they were searching for. What increased Elizabeth's suspicions about Ted was the strange things she found in his possession. She saw the crutches he used, the materials he used to make the fake cast on his arm, extra keys, and tools she couldn't understand the purpose of. On top of that, he would disappear for several days at a time. Where was he going? What was he doing? Elizabeth kept contacting the police, but they refused to take action against her boyfriend. Eventually, they told her, "If you really want us to investigate this, and if you're confident in what you're saying, come down to the station and file an official report." But she was afraid. She wasn't ready to confront Ted and officially accuse him. She wanted the police to investigate him on their own, to follow him and gather evidence. She wasn't willing to put herself in that position. So she let the matter go and stopped contacting them. She tried to continue her life as normally as possible. But of course, she was terrified the entire time. Imagine how she felt, living with a man she knew was a monstrous killer. She couldn't even break up with him because she was certain that if she did, he would kill her. He had already tried to kill her when he drowned her in the river, even though she had done nothing to him. So what would he do if she actually tried to leave him? The police in Washington state constantly expected another crime to occur at any moment, another girl to disappear. But in the following months, all the crimes in the area stopped. No girls went missing. Ted knew that things in Washington and the surrounding areas had become too dangerous. The information and descriptions about him had made it risky for him to stay. So he made a simple decision to move to another state under the pretense of continuing his studies. He transferred from his law school to a new university in Utah. Utah wasn't too far from Washington, but there was enough distance between them. He still wanted to continue his crimes, but he needed a fresh start in a place where no one knew him. Back then, in the 1970s, there was little communication between state police departments, so there was no system in place to alert Utah authorities about a suspect like him. The same applied to the media. Local newspapers and TV stations in Utah had no reason to publish his face or description for the public. Ted enrolled at the University of Utah, made new friends, and even started attending church. He expanded his social circle, gaining more friends and acquaintances. Everyone who knew him at the time had the same impression. He was a well-mannered, likable, and intelligent person. It didn't take him long to settle into life in Utah. Within just a few weeks, he resumed his role as a serial killer. He began walking the streets, public places, and parks, looking for new victims. In just 1 month, October 1974, Ted kidnapped and murdered 3 women in Utah. Just as he had done in Washington, he lived a double life. On one side, he was a ruthless killer. On the other, he was a charming and friendly man, well-liked by those around him. This was perhaps his greatest skill, convincing people he was completely normal. No one would ever suspect that the devil himself was hiding behind that face. But from this point on, things would escalate quickly. The next victim Ted chose would cause him some trouble. On November 8, 1974, there was a girl named Carol Ranch, 18 years old. Ted had been following her for some time and saw her enter a shopping mall. Carol had driven there in her car and parked it outside. Ted went over, memorized her license plate number, and waited for her at the mall entrance. When she came out, he approached her and started talking. He said, "Excuse me, is your car's license plate number?" She replied, "Yes." He then said, "I'm Officer Roseland. We just caught a man trying to break into your car." Carol was shocked. Ted continued, "Let's go check your car to see if he caused any damage or stole anything." They walked over together and she inspected her car. Everything seemed fine, nothing was missing, and the car was intact. Ted reassured her, "We caught the man, but I need you to come with me to the station to file a report." He added, "The station is just across the street." Carol hesitated and felt uneasy. She asked, "Do you have any ID to prove you're a cop?" Ted pulled out a police badge and showed it to her. Then he said, "We'll go to the station in my car." Carol was still uncertain, but she followed him. However, when they reached his car, she was surprised. She had expected to see a police car, but instead she saw his Volkswagen Beetle. She asked, "This is your car?" He replied, I'm currently working undercover, so I use this car to avoid drawing attention. She reluctantly got in. During the ride, Carol noticed something strange. The man was driving away from the mall instead of heading toward the station, which he had said was nearby. She also noticed he was taking multiple turns. She asked, "What's going on? Where are we going?" He responded vaguely, "We're going to the station." She pressed, "But you told me the station was across the street and now we're driving farther away. Where exactly are you taking me?" At that point, Ted went silent. He continued driving, heading out of the city. Carol panicked. She started screaming, let me out now." Ted ignored her. She realized she had to act fast. She decided to throw herself out of the moving car. She reached for the door handle, but Ted immediately grabbed her, pulled her toward him, and stopped the car. He then tried to handcuff her, but he only managed to secure one of her wrists. Her other hand remained free. As they struggled inside the stopped car, Carol managed to open the door. At the same moment, she broke free from his grip and ran out. She ran as fast as she could, not looking back. Ted chased after her. He managed to trip her momentarily, and they both fell to the ground. But Carol, fueled by pure adrenaline, quickly got back up and kept running at full speed. Ted decided not to chase her any further. Instead, he ran back to his car and drove away. Carol kept running until she saw another car on a different street. She signaled to the drivers and they stopped for her. She got into their car and told them that someone had just tried to kidnap her. They took her straight to the police station. Carol became the first victim to escape from Ted Bundy, the first person to survive his clutches. As for Ted, you might think he went home, tried to calm himself down and processed what had happened. But no, he was furious. His victim had escaped and he needed to release his anger. Murder to him was like a drug. If he didn't get his fix, he would go insane. So on that same night, right after Carol escaped, he went looking for another victim. He found a girl named Debbie Kent and added her to his list of victims. Meanwhile, at the police station, Carol gave her full account of what had happened. She described Ted's appearance and told them about his beige Volkswagen Beetle. Just like in Washington, the Utah police created a new sketch of Ted and published it in the newspapers and on the news. The story spread, even reaching Washington. People and police officers started suspecting that this killer was the same Ted who had disappeared from Washington and was now committing similar crimes in Utah, targeting young women. Ted felt uneasy when he saw his case gaining attention in Utah. Now, most people, especially women, would likely be on high alert. His name and description were fresh news, spreading all over the state. So, Ted decided to pause his crimes in Utah for the time being. He even traveled back to Washington for the Christmas holidays at the end of 1974. He returned to Elizabeth, who was still terrified of him. At least she had felt some relief while he was away studying in Utah. By the way, Elizabeth had heard about the murders in Utah and immediately knew that Ted was behind them. She even tried to contact the police again for the third time after learning about the Utah murders. But just like before, the police didn't take her seriously. And now, as we said, Ted was back for Christmas. He spent more than a week in her home with her and her young daughter. Imagine what Elizabeth must have felt at that moment, forced to live with a monster. He was literally a devil, sitting with her, laughing, eating, sleeping, and even playing with her daughter. She couldn't leave him because she knew that doing so would be the end of her. And no one could help her because even the police themselves refused to take her seriously. But finally, that difficult week ended, the holiday was over, and Ted returned to Utah to continue his studies. Immediately upon arriving in Utah, his urge to kill returned. However, his name had already spread, and people were on high alert. So, Ted decided to change his hunting ground. He took a trip to Colorado, a neighboring state to Utah, and committed several crimes in different cities. He moved from place to place, never intending to settle in Colorado. It was just a temporary killing spree for him. After that, he left Colorado and went to Idaho, which was between Washington and Utah. There, he did the same thing, committing several crimes and adding new victims to his list. Some of these victims were even younger, schoolgirls. Time passed, and Ted continued his killing spree. By August 1975, it had been 9 months since he had tried to kidnap Carol, the only victim who had managed to escape from him. Despite constantly moving around, Ted's primary base was still in Utah. One night, while he was driving his car down the street, a police officer was on night patrol, sitting in his car. Ted drove past him, and the officer felt something suspicious. He decided to follow Ted, turned on his lights, and ordered him to pull over. But Ted decided to run. He stepped on the gas, trying to escape. A chase ensued for a few minutes before Ted finally pulled over, got out of the car with his hands raised, and repeatedly apologized, claiming he hadn't realized the officer wanted him to stop. The officer decided to search his car and was shocked by what he found inside. First, the passenger seat was missing. It had been completely removed. Even stranger, he found tools that looked like burglary equipment, masks, gloves, ropes, wires, handcuffs, and other suspicious items. The officer immediately arrested Ted and took him to the station. This was Ted Bundy's first mugshot after being arrested. News of his arrest spread among the police force. Some officers quickly noticed that Ted owned a beige Volkswagen Beetle, the same car described in the serial killer case. His name was also Ted, just like the suspect they had been looking for months. The detectives handling the cases of the murdered and missing women realized that this was likely the killer they had been searching for. They also remembered that they had a key witness, Carol Daranch, the only victim who had escaped. A common technique used by investigators is to place a suspect among several individuals with similar appearances and have the witness identify them. If the witness immediately recognizes the suspect, it confirms their reliability and the suspect's guilt. When they showed Carol a lineup of men, her eyes immediately locked onto Ted. Without hesitation, she pointed at him and said, "That's the man who tried to kidnap me." At that moment, the detectives were sure they had found their killer, but they still needed to build a solid case against him. They had to gather evidence and question people close to him. That's when they finally reached out to his girlfriend, Elizabeth, in Washington. To their shock, they discovered that she had been trying to report Ted for a long time. The detectives in Utah were stunned. How had Washington police ignored Ted despite his own girlfriend trying to turn him in? They interviewed Elizabeth and asked her everything she knew about Ted, his habits, his personality, his behavior. She told them everything. But in the end, her words were still just testimony. Even she didn't have concrete evidence to convict him. Still, her testimony was valuable and helped the case. The police searched Ted's apartment in Utah and found some potential evidence, though mostly circumstantial. They found gas station receipts from the same states and cities where the murders had occurred. They found hotel reservation records that matched the locations of some victims. One of the victims had even stayed at the same hotel as Ted on the same night, suggesting that he had followed her from there. That hotel was in Colorado, where Ted had committed some of his crimes. When they thoroughly searched his car, they found strands of hair that matched 3 of the victims. At that time, DNA testing didn't exist, but they could match the hair's color and texture. There was still no absolute proof against Ted, but when all the small pieces of evidence were combined, they could be enough in court. Ted Bundy's trial began on February 23, 1976. Ted chose to be his own lawyer, using his law studies as justification. Legally, anyone can defend themselves in court, whether they have a law degree or not. Ted was confident. He believed he could charm the judge and convince everyone of his innocence. He insisted he was not guilty. But within just 4 days of trial, the judge found him guilty. However, this conviction was only for the attempted kidnapping of Carol, the girl who had escaped him. The judge did not sentence him for any murders at this point. His sentence was between 1 and 15 years in prison. You might be wondering, what kind of sentence is that? 1 to 15 years? It meant that the sentence would begin immediately, while further investigations against Ted continued. This was not a final verdict. The police would continue their investigations into other crimes, and he would likely face more trials for additional victims. The investigations took a long time. Over a year passed before Ted Bundy was put on trial again. This time, the trial took place in Colorado, not Utah. Investigators had found enough evidence linking him to the murders in Colorado, including the hotel reservation that matched one of the victims. The new trial began in June 1977. Once again, Ted defended himself. Being his own lawyer gave him certain privileges. He was allowed to wear regular clothes instead of a prison uniform. He was not handcuffed in court. The trial sessions continued for some time. During this period, Ted was granted access to the court's law library between sessions to read legal books. The library was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. A guard was always assigned to watch Ted, but sometimes the guard would step outside for a smoke break, standing by a window near the library entrance. He assumed the library door was the only way in and out since they were on the second floor. Ted saw an opportunity. He moved to a corner of the library that was out of sight. That corner had a window. Without hesitation, he opened the window and jumped from the second floor. Then, he ran straight into the streets. Imagine the madman escaped from the courthouse. He jumped from the second floor. Fortunately for him, the ground was soft, covered in grass and dirt rather than concrete. Even so, he injured his leg. No one noticed for 10 minutes. A woman saw Ted jumping, went inside, and reported it. Only then did his assigned guard realize he had escaped. The police and the FBI were immediately alerted. They sent out alerts across various states, especially those where Ted had committed his crimes. They expected he might try to return to Washington. Ted fled to mountainous and forested areas to hide from view. He knew the police and the FBI would turn the country upside down searching for him. He kept moving from place to place, going farther and farther away, avoiding cities and populated areas. After several days of traveling on foot, he grew exhausted, especially with his injury. He decided to steal a car. He found one, stole it, and began driving. That night, as he was driving through the streets, suddenly a police car appeared behind him. The officer immediately recognized him and said, "Welcome, come with us." Ted was caught just 6 days after his escape. He didn't last long. He was placed back in prison to await his trial once again. The trial would take several months to begin. This was Ted's prison cell. He had law books and even a typewriter. Once again, these were privileges given to him because he was acting as his own lawyer. But imagine this. One morning, the guards went to his cell and didn't find him. Ted Bundy had escaped again. This time, he had escaped from prison, not the courthouse. How did he do it? Ted had noticed a small opening in the ceiling. It was a light fixture and it was supposed to be sealed with metal, but it was only covered with a plastic sheet. He saw an opportunity. The problem was that the opening was extremely small. It wouldn't fit him. So he needed to lose weight. To do this without raising suspicion, he constantly complained about the prison food. He always said it tasted bad and refused to eat. Over about 6 months, he lost more than 15 kilograms, all just to fit through that hole. Of course, the hole wasn't open. He had to cut through the plastic cover. Somehow, he managed to get hold of a small saw from another inmate. Once everything was ready, he chose the perfect time to escape, New Year's Eve. Most prison staff and guards would be off duty. So on December 30, 1977, the last day of the year, Ted put his plan into action. Before escaping, he arranged some books on his bed and covered them with a blanket to make it look like he was sleeping. He climbed onto the top bunk, cut through the hole, and squeezed through it, thanks to his reduced weight. Through that opening, he reached the prison's ventilation system and followed the pipes that connected different rooms. He ended up in one of the guards' rooms. There, he found a guard's uniform, put it on, and simply walked out pretending to be one of them. He walked confidently through the prison, blending in, and successfully escaped. The news spread like wildfire across America. Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer, had escaped from prison again. Every media outlet covered the story, especially in the western states where he had committed his crimes. Even in other states, his story was well known. People were fascinated because serial killers were not common at the time. As we've said before, Ted Bundy was the father of serial killers in America. He inspired many who came after him. Ted knew that the best thing he could do was get as far away as possible from the northwestern states, where everyone, including the police and the FBI, was searching for him. So, he decided to head south, specifically to Florida, which was far from all the states where he had committed his crimes. You might think Ted would try to hide in Florida and lay low. But as I told you before, killing was like a drug for him. And now, after nearly 3 years between trials and prison, he hadn't been able to consume his addiction. He needed to compensate. Ted arrived in Florida on January 8, 1978. Immediately, he began looking for a place where he could find new victims. He knew his time was probably limited and that he would be caught sooner or later. So he wanted to make the most of what could be his last opportunity. As usual, he targeted colleges and universities, his familiar hunting grounds. He observed the surroundings of Florida State University from a distance and discovered a nearby sorority house, a large dormitory where dozens of female students lived. Ted knew this would be his next target. On January 15, 1978, at around 3 a.m., Ted broke into the sorority house through the back door. He was carrying a thick wooden club. His first target was a student named Margaret Bowman. He randomly entered her room while she was sleeping and immediately attacked her with the club. She likely lost consciousness instantly, not even having a chance to wake up. Then, Ted took a small rope, wrapped it around her neck, and strangled her until he was sure she was dead. Her roommate, who was in the next room, later said that she woke up to the sound of thumping, like someone being hit. But the noise stopped quickly, so she went back to sleep. That may have been what saved her life. If she had gone to check, Ted might have had the chance to kill her too. After finishing with his first victim, Ted left the room and moved to another. Again, the selection was random. This time, the room belonged to a student named Lisa Levy. Ted attacked her in the same way, hitting her with the club and then strangling her. But this time, he also bit her, twice. The bites were so deep that they left clear marks on her body. Remember these bite marks, they will play an important role later. Ted then entered a third room, but this time there were 2 girls in the room instead of 1. So, he attacked both of them at once, hitting them with the club and using his hands. However, one of the girls managed to scream before losing consciousness. That moment made Ted decide to flee. He ran toward the door. As he was going down the stairs, another student named Nita Neary saw him clearly before he left. Even after escaping the sorority house, Ted still wasn't satisfied. It was as if he was trying to make up for the past 3 years. So he went to another student's apartment. This time, it wasn't a dorm, it was just a private apartment. The victim was a young woman named Charlotte Thomas. Using the same method, Ted surprised her in her sleep and attacked her. But again, she managed to scream before he could kill her. The neighbors heard the screams and called the police. Ted panicked and fled before he could finish his crime. He was in such a hurry that he jumped out of the window. Although the girl survived, his attack left her with permanent injuries. Shortly afterward, ambulances and police arrived. They treated the 2 surviving girls from the sorority house and the young woman from the apartment. The police interviewed witnesses, especially Nita Neary, the student who had seen Ted clearly before he fled. As we said, Ted Bundy's story was already well known across America, but the search for him had been mainly focused on the northwestern states. The police in Florida quickly connected these crimes to him. They noticed striking similarities and suspected that the killer was none other than Ted Bundy. They asked for help from the FBI and law enforcement in Washington, Utah, and Colorado to gather all possible information about him. Ted's attack on the sorority house caused a media explosion, especially in Florida. The police searched for him everywhere. In February 1978, Ted committed his final murder. His last victim was a 12-year-old girl. The details are too horrific to mention. By that time, police patrols and checkpoints had increased dramatically. Ted decided to leave Florida. Once again, he stole a car. This time, it was another Volkswagen Beetle, similar to his old one, but this time, it was orange. During a night patrol, an officer noticed the car. He contacted the station and provided the license plate number. The station responded that the car had been reported stolen. The officer immediately followed the car and pulled the driver over, who was Ted. The officer ordered him to get out and stand next to the police car with his back turned. But Ted wasn't ready to surrender. He knew that if he gave up now, it would be the end. He tried to surprise the officer and grab his gun, but the officer was alert. He managed to push Ted away. Ted then tried to run. The officer drew his gun and ordered him to stop. Ted ignored the warning and kept running. The officer fired his weapon. Ted fell to the ground. However, the bullet didn't actually hit him, he was faking it. He lay still, pretending to be wounded. As the officer approached to check on him, Ted suddenly attacked again, trying to grab the gun once more. But the officer was focused and ready. He overpowered Ted and struck him on the head with the butt of his gun. Ted collapsed to the ground, unable to move. For the first time, he felt what his victims had felt. The officer finally subdued him and placed him under arrest. After the officer returned to the station with the man he thought was just a car thief, it didn't take long before they identified him. They realized that this so-called thief was actually Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer and the FBI's most wanted man at the time. Immediately, police departments across different states coordinated to confirm his identity. Now, all case files and information were transferred to Florida because that's where he had been arrested, meaning he would be tried there. That's the law, you're prosecuted in the state where you're caught. This time, they placed him in a high-security cell. The FBI investigator in charge of his case secured his cell door with 3 locks. Each key was held by a different guard. The cell could only be opened if all 3 guards were present at the same time. Ted spent about a year and a half in prison while the case against him was being built. Investigators left no stone unturned. They gathered all the witnesses, collected all possible evidence, and thoroughly investigated the recent murders in Florida to build a solid case. One of the strongest pieces of evidence against him was the bite marks he left on one of his victims, the girl from the sorority house. The detectives forced Ted to provide a dental impression and compared it to the bite marks found on her body. It was an exact match. This was irrefutable evidence. Ted Bundy's trial began in June 1979. It was the first ever trial in U.S. history to be broadcast live on television. Imagine the number of people watching. The entire country had already been following the case. Because of the public interest, the trial was televised to make an example of Ted. This is why Ted Bundy is the most famous serial killer in history. The media coverage was insane. It wasn't just American media. Even international news outlets covered the trial and reported every detail. This time, Ted knew the trial would be more difficult. So, he accepted a defense attorney to represent him instead of defending himself. The lawyer was named John Henry Brown. If you remember, in a previous video, I talked about a reckless teenager who stole houses, cars, boats, and even airplanes. This was the same lawyer who defended that teenager. However, John Henry Brown's goal wasn't to prove Ted's innocence. His only aim was to prevent Ted from getting the death penalty. At that time, capital punishment was still legal in many U.S. states. The only way to avoid execution was for Ted to plead guilty and fully confess to all his crimes in exchange for a life sentence. But Ted refused. He insisted he was innocent, even though everyone, including his own lawyer, knew he was guilty. His lawyer told him, "If you don't plan to confess, then I'm withdrawing from your case." Ted simply replied, "Goodbye then." So he went back to defending himself in court. He became his own lawyer again. There were other attorneys on his defense team, but he appointed himself as the lead attorney. This allowed him to enter the courtroom in a suit, looking well-dressed and composed, instead of appearing in prisoner's clothes and shackles. He walked in, confident and charming, talking and interacting with people as if he were some sort of respectable figure. He even smiled for the cameras whenever they focused on him. A devious devil. Ted was trying to maintain the fake persona that had allowed him to manipulate people all along. The persona of a successful, intelligent, and well-spoken man. It was as if he wanted to see if he could fool the entire world with his fake mask. Throughout the trial, he spoke calmly and confidently. And here's the shocking part. As his own lawyer, he had the right to cross-examine witnesses. This meant that he got to question his own victims in court. The survivors, Carol Ranch, who escaped from him, the 2 sorority girls who survived, and the last girl he attacked in her apartment, all had to stand on the witness stand in front of him while he questioned them. Can you imagine? A serial killer interrogating his own victims in court, and he enjoyed every second of it. He felt like he was in control of the courtroom, as if he were the one in charge. He talked, moved, and laughed, acting like he wasn't even on trial for multiple murders. But no matter how hard he tried, the evidence and witnesses against him were far too strong. And the strongest evidence was the bite marks, which perfectly matched his dental impression. This was undeniable proof. It was like he had signed his name on his victim's body. On July 24, 1979, the jury announced their verdict. Ted Bundy was guilty. At the end of the trial, the judge sentenced him to death. Ted was shocked, as if he had never expected this outcome. It was as if he truly believed he could deceive everyone and walk free. Even though he was sentenced to death, the execution was delayed year after year. Why? Because Ted kept revealing details about his victims to the investigators, one piece at a time. This was his way of buying time and postponing his execution. There are hours of recorded confessions from him, filled with details about his crimes. That's why we know so much about his victims and how he committed his murders. Ted confessed to 30 murders, but he spread out his confessions over 10 years. Every time they scheduled an execution date, he would say, "I have more confessions and more victims to tell you about." So, he kept revealing names and details bit by bit. Until the authorities finally lost patience and set a final execution date, telling him, "No matter what you say now, you will be executed on this day." Ted admitted to 30 murders before his execution, but investigators believe the real number was much higher, possibly over 100 victims. His execution was scheduled for January 24, 1989. On that day, huge crowds gathered outside the prison where it would take place. People were literally celebrating his execution. They were cheering and chanting, saying things like, "Burn, Bundy, burn!" And at 7 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair. They say that even in his final moments, he was still trying to bargain for more time, claiming he had more names and details he hadn't revealed yet. But the execution went ahead. And with that, the world closed the chapter on its most infamous serial killer. In the end, I won't say, if you liked the story, leave a like, because you shouldn't like a story like this. But if you found it interesting, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And here are some other great videos you can check out. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Goodbye.